Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Happy New Year, everyone. My name is David Judas, and I head up the intermediary sales and national accounts team at Barron Capital. Today, we're going to be talking to our investment teams about insights into the GLP-1 drugs, the ones that shed all the pounds that people are taking lately. A timely topic given New Year's resolutions. Our speakers today are going to be Barron Healthcare Fund portfolio managers Neal Kaufman and Josh Riegelhaupt, and analyst Wendy Lin. They represent the 43-member Barron research team, which is the intellectual capital engine and competitive advantage behind our alpha generation capabilities. According to Morningstar, the Barron Healthcare Fund, ticker BHCHX, is ranked in the first percentile for the trailing 5-year period as of 12/31/23, an annualized return of 15.43% versus only 8.65 for the Morningstar peer group and 1079 for the Russell 3000 healthcare benchmark. The fund's also in the first percentile and actually the number one ranked fund for the since inception period in 2018 to 12/23. The fund's rated 4 stars by Morningstar, and in addition, in 2021, received the Lipper Award for the top healthcare fund over the 3-year period. While we will be taking questions after our team's remarks today, we have a long queue, so thank you for that. We do encourage you to submit questions either at the chat on your screen or by emailing questions@barronfunds.com. A few important disclaimers before we start. The information provided in the webinar today is for educational purposes only. This does not constitute medical advice, so I think that's an important one. So please read that, and just a few more disclaimers to get through before we're going to kick it off with Neal Kaufman. So let's begin. Neal, could you start us out with why are we talking about the GLP-1 drugs?
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Neal Kaufman. I manage the Barron Healthcare Fund. The purpose of this webinar is to educate our clients about a class of drugs that we think will be the largest drug class ever. Last year, Novo Nordisk released the headline results from its SELECT study, which showed its weight loss medicine Wegovy reduced the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events in non-diabetic obese patients by 20%. That news caused shockwaves as investors digested the potential impact of this drug class on companies throughout healthcare and other sectors. Our focus today is to provide background information on this drug class, discuss a few healthcare stocks, and answer your questions. With that, I'll turn it over to Wendy Lin, who is an analyst on our healthcare research team.
Thanks, Neal. So this is the moment we all dreaded in class. We're going to start with a pop quiz. So the question is, what percentage of US adults are obese with a BMI of over 30 today? I'm going to give you 5 seconds to think of your answer. All right, 3, 2, 1. The answer is 40%. And actually, we'll explain how over 50% of American adults are eligible for GLP-1 drugs, since the label includes certain patients with a BMI under 30. The US is facing an obesity crisis. 13% of American adults were obese in 1980. That number went to 30% in 2000 and is over 40% today. And some experts think that 50% of American adults could be obese with a BMI of over 30 by 2030. GLP-1s could be a major tool in fighting obesity. Treating obesity isn't just about weight loss and looking better. Obesity is part of metabolic syndrome and significantly increases your risk of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and the list goes on. In total, over 50% of American adults could qualify for GLP-1 treatment for being obese, overweight with comorbidities like high cholesterol or high blood pressure, or having type 2 diabetes. So today we're going to talk about what these GLP-1 drugs are, how they work and how well they work, whether the GLP-1 drugs are safe, how much they cost, and how big the opportunity is and how Barron Capital is thinking about investing behind this theme. We're going to start with a biology and history lesson, so buckle up. GLP-1, or glucagon-like peptide 1, is a natural hormone that humans make after they eat food. The first thing scientists knew about GLP-1 was that it helps with blood sugar control. GLP-1 stimulates insulin production. Insulin is a hormone that takes sugar from the blood and stores it into muscles and organs. An average adult consumes about 20 teaspoons of added sugar a day. There's about 10 teaspoons of sugar in a can of Coke. But even if you're relatively healthy, you're consuming carbs in the form of bread, fruit, and vegetables, which are ultimately converted to sugar. So an average adult consumes maybe 20 teaspoons of added sugar and maybe another 40 teaspoons of sugar in the form of healthy carbs. In contrast, a healthy adult has only about 1 teaspoon of sugar in their blood at a given time. And having high or low blood sugar is very dangerous, and there's a complex system of hormones that regulates how much sugar is in the blood and how much is safely stored in the liver and muscles. Insulin and GLP-1, as well as a number of other hormones, are part of that complex system to tightly control blood sugar. You've probably heard of type 2 diabetes. These patients can't keep their blood sugar levels under control, and their hormone system that regulates blood sugar is out of whack. That's where GLP-1 comes in. GLP-1, the hormone, was discovered in the 1980s, but it's naturally very short-lived. It disappears in minutes in the human body. To help treat diabetes, scientists developed drugs that act like GLP-1 does on its receptors. The first GLP-1 drug was approved to treat diabetes in 2005. And fun fact, the first GLP-1 drugs were derived from a molecule that was found in the saliva of the Gila monster lizard. Then, scientists realized that GLP-1 has additional effects on the body. For one, it delays gastric emptying, which helps reduce appetite, but can also cause side effects like nausea and vomiting. These side effects mostly happen when you're starting on the drug. They're mild, and we'll talk more about them later. And the third effect is that GLP-1 also stimulates satiety receptors in the brain and tells your brain that you're full. This reduces appetite and may even reduce other cravings. More and more, scientists think that this brain effect is driving more of the weight loss effect. The first GLP-1 drug was approved for type 2 diabetes in 2005, and there have been several generations of GLP-1 drugs for type 2 diabetes since then. Each new version has driven better blood sugar control and is more convenient. These have gone from twice daily shots to once a week shots. And adoption has accelerated over the past decade as doctors have started prescribing it earlier in treating type 2 diabetes. A patient used to try every type of available pill before trying an injectable GLP-1. But because of how well these drugs work, doctors have started prescribing GLP-1s in newly diagnosed diabetes. We think about 2% of American type 2 diabetics were on GLP-1s in 2014, and that number is closer to 15% today. But why are we getting so excited now? The previous GLP-1 drugs were good diabetes drugs, but they drove only limited weight loss. Even high-dose Victoza, which was marketed as Saxenda for weight loss, only drove about 5% weight loss. The newest GLP-1s drive significant weight loss on the order of 15 to 20% of the patient's starting body weight. And the companies are now launching these new GLP-1 drugs as obesity drugs. Novo Nordisk's Wegovy was approved for obesity in 2021, and Eli Lilly's Zepbound was approved for obesity in 2023. Wegovy is the same drug as Ozempic, and Zepbound is the same drug as Mounjaro, but Ozempic and Mounjaro are approved as diabetes drugs, and Wegovy and Zepbound are approved as obesity drugs. And side note, we're going to keep it simple today and call all of these drugs GLP-1s, but Mounjaro works through the GLP-1 pathway, as well as another similar pathway called GIP, which adds additional weight loss and metabolic benefits. But to keep it simple, we're going to call all of these drugs GLP-1s today. Despite all of the awareness about these drugs, we're still at the beginning of the first inning. Based on our analysis of prescription data, we think that 14% of US type 2 diabetics are on a GLP-1 drug, and only 1% of the US obese population is on a GLP-1 drug. Let's talk about how well these drugs work. In the phase 3 clinical studies, patients on Wegovy lost about 17% of their body weight over 16 months, and patients on Zepbound lost 23% of their body weight. I'm going to pause to let that sink in. And as we know, obesity is really part of broader metabolic disease and arguably is the main driver of metabolic disease. Last year, Novo announced that a study of Wegovy in obese patients with cardiovascular disease showed that patients on Wegovy had significantly fewer heart attacks, strokes, and deaths due to cardiovascular causes. So in the graph on the left, the orange line is semaglutide or Wegovy, and the gray line is placebo. The y-axis is the cumulative incidence of events. And over the course of 4 years, patients on Wegovy had 20% less risk of heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular deaths. It wasn't the primary endpoint the study was designed to show, but in the same study, patients on Wegovy had a 19% less risk of dying from any cause. So GLP-1s are literally saving lives. GLP-1s probably also help to reduce other linked diseases, such as sleep apnea, heart failure, chronic kidney disease, and fatty liver, known as NASH. And Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk are running studies to show those benefits as well. The logical next question is, are GLP-1s safe? We'll start by saying that there's no real reason to think that they're not. Weight loss itself isn't unsafe. Doctors have been using very low-calorie diets, like 800 calories a day, think meal replacement shakes, under medical supervision for decades. They're generally very safe, and the real issue is that the weight loss isn't sustainable once the patient goes back to their normal diet. Diabetics have been using GLP-1 drugs for 18 years with no major safety issues. Side note, as we mentioned earlier, Zepbound is a GLP-1 and a GIP. That additional GIP action doesn't have that 18-year real-world history, but we do have 30,000 patient years of clinical trial experience with no significant issues. The main side effects of GLP-1 drugs are GI-related, such as nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and constipation. They're generally mild and manageable. These relate to how the drug works through the brain receptors and the slowed gastric emptying. It's important to have a medical professional that can help you get up to your final dose. The way you start taking these drugs is that you start with a very low dose for a few weeks, then you step it up for a few weeks, and then you keep doing that until you get to your final dose. It can take 5 months or more to get to your final dose. And this is important because the side effects are related to your body getting used to the dose that you're on. Some patients get severe side effects and really can't tolerate the drug, but the doctors that we've spoken with say that this is only about 5% of their patients if they're getting adequate support. Then, as with all of life, there's a small risk of other rare side effects. There's a risk with anything, so you should talk with a professional. So how much do these drugs cost? The news talks about a $10,000 or $15,000 a year price, but that's a list price. The drug pricing system in the US is very complicated and confusing, but after negotiated discounts and rebates, the average insurance company is paying about $6,000 a year per patient for these drugs. From a patient's perspective, if you have insurance coverage, you should only have to pay a copay, which is about $25 per month or 3 months depending on your plan. The manufacturers also offer coupon cards that can reduce your copay if it's on the higher end. If you have diabetes, the vast majority of insurance plans cover the GLP-1 drugs. If you have commercial insurance and your insurance plan doesn't cover GLP-1s for obesity, you're on the hook for that list price of $12,000 to $16,000 a year. But Eli Lilly is offering a cash pay discount on Zepbound that works out to $6,600 a year, and Novo Nordisk offers a similar discount, but that price is still closer to $11,000 a year. Medicare covers the drugs for diabetes, but unfortunately does not yet cover it for obesity. But that's what these drugs cost today. Generally speaking, mass market drugs that are used by large numbers of patients decline in net price every year, and we expect GLP-1 pricing to come down over time. However, these launches remain supply constrained in the near term, and the companies have no incentive to lower prices until they can supply the market. We think there are a few factors that could drive price down later in the decade. We think the first oral GLP-1 made by Eli Lilly could become available in 2027. Oral drugs are easier to manufacture and scale, and oral drugs have a lower cost of goods, so the company can lower the price and still make a good margin. There could be additional companies launching competitive drugs starting in 2028, And if Medicare price negotiation under the Inflation Reduction Act happens, it could affect Ozempic starting in 2027. In the near term, the industry is working hard to increase manufacturing supply, but that 2027 timeframe is also when we expect supply to accelerate, price to start coming down, and access to open up more broadly. Ultimately, we think net pricing could come down to $2,000 to $3,000 per patient per year. Early health economics research actually supports a price in the $5,000 to $10,000 per patient per year range. Obesity costs the US healthcare system $200 billion a year in healthcare costs. This health economics research, looks at the direct healthcare costs that GLP-1s can help save, as well as the price we as a society are willing to pay to gain a year of healthy lifespan. But we get to that $2,000 to $3,000 net price range because other mass market primary care drugs that launched in the last 10 to 15 years, such as migraine injections and blood thinner pills, are in that price range. So how big is the opportunity? The market size is the product of the number of patients multiplied by the price per patient. We just talked about the price per patient, so let's look at how many patients could be on GLP-1 drugs. 13% of American adults have diabetes, so that's about 32 million type 2 diabetics. 40% of American adults are obese, and that's about 87 million obese patients who don't have diabetes. And another 30% of American adults are overweight, many of whom have comorbidities like high cholesterol or high blood pressure, and that adds another 18 million patients. Adding that up totals to 137 million American adults in the US that are eligible for GLP-1 drugs, or more than 50%. The next question is, what could peak penetration look like? Based on analyzing prescription trends for statins and blood pressure medications, we think that about 50% of people with high cholesterol or high blood pressure are compliant with their medications. It took 20 to 30 years to get to peak penetration for these medicines, but we think obesity could launch faster because obesity isn't asymptomatic. Patients are eager to be treated, and patient awareness is much higher. So how big could this class be? The answer is very big. If something like 60% of diabetics and 30% of other eligible obese patients are on the drug in 10 to 15 years, at something like $2,000 to $3,000 per patient per year, that's $100 to $150 billion peak sales in the US alone. Add in some European and rest of world sales, and you could see how this market could easily be greater than $150 billion. So why is there so much skepticism? For one, the numbers are big. Very few people remember a big primary care launch. The last major new drug categories that addressed a huge swath of the US populations were statins and blood pressure medications in the 1980s and 1990s. Obesity as a disease is new, so 13% of Americans were obese in 1980. That number is over 40% today. And obese as a disease wasn't culturally recognized as a medical condition until recently. People might say it's too easy, but pardon the pun, maybe sometimes there is such a thing as free lunch. So what's next? We think there could be higher efficacy injections for severe patients. Both Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk have next-gen versions in phase 3 development that drive even more weight loss. We think there could be once-daily pills for less severe patients. Eli Lilly is leading here with a pill in late-stage trials that seems to drive as much weight loss as Ozempic and Wegovy. We are tracking over 50 different drugs in development. Companies, including Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, are looking at adding additional drug mechanisms to drive even more weight loss or provide other specific benefits, such as treating fatty liver disease. Ultimately, we think that incumbency and first to market will matter unless a new drug is meaningfully better, but that there's room for multiple players to win. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to Neal, who will talk about some of the companies that we like that are benefiting from GLP-1s.
Thanks, Wendy. As Wendy discussed, we think the market for GLP-1 medicines will be very large over the next decade, perhaps reaching $150 billion, which would make it the largest drug class ever. The Barron Healthcare Fund has been investing in this market primarily through ownership of Eli Lilly. Lilly offers Mounjaro for diabetes and Zepbound for obesity, and has a pipeline of future generation GLP-1 medicines, including a triple hormone receptor agonist, which has shown even greater weight loss in clinical trials, and a daily oral GLP-1, which would expand market access because it's less complex and costly to manufacture, and it offers the convenience of a daily oral medicine. Beyond Lilly's leadership position in diabetes and obesity, Lilly is also a leader in the development of medicines for Alzheimer's disease, as well as oncology and immunology. In addition, Lilly has been expanding its internal pipeline with early-stage external assets, which could contribute to growth in the out years. While Lilly stock has significantly outperformed its peers over the past 6 years, and now has a $600 billion market cap, roughly, with a high valuation on near-term estimates, we think Lilly is a unique company with a unique growth profile, strong competitive advantages, and a top-rate management team. In thinking about valuation, you have to consider a few things. First, Lilly's R&D productivity is well above the industry. Second, we think Lilly and its primary competitor in the GLP-1 class, Novo Nordisk, have significant competitive advantages in the diabetes and obesity market. They have first mover advantage, clinical development expertise, manufacturing capacity, and payer relationship advantages. So how should we think about valuation? Well, we value the stock on a DCF basis, but for simplicity, another way to look at valuation is this. We can think about a multiple on 2030 EPS and then add the free cash flow per share that Lilly generates from 2023 through 2030. We estimate Lilly's revenue will grow from roughly $34 billion in 2023 to roughly $90 billion in 2030. And we estimate adjusted EPS will increase from roughly $10 per share to roughly $40 per share in that time period. In other words, sales will triple and earnings are going to increase by roughly 4 times in our estimation. So what's the right multiple? Well, it depends on what Lilly's growth profile will look like in the period beyond 2030. We think Lilly can continue to grow its top line above peers beyond 2030, which supports a multiple above where mature pharma companies typically trade. So if you assume a 20 times multiple on 2030 EPS of 40, that gets you to an $800 stock price. Plus, Lilly will have generated roughly $150 per share in free cash flow. So adding $800 per share plus $150 per share, you can get to a $950 stock price in roughly 5 to 6 years. Besides Lilly, we've also been investors in 2 picks and shovels companies that make products for injectable medicines. West Pharmaceuticals makes syringe plungers that are used in GLP-1 injection devices. West also serves as a contract manufacturer of autoinjectors used with GLP-1 medicines. West's long-term revenue growth target is 7 to 9% annual growth, and we think that West's products for GLP-1s could add a couple of points of growth to this growth rate. Stevanato makes glass syringes and cartridges that go into pens and autoinjectors, and will also start to serve as a contract manufacturer of autoinjectors that are used with GLP-1 medicines. Stevanato's long-term revenue growth target is low teens annual growth, and we estimate GLP-1s could add a couple of points of growth to this growth rate. We're also researching and tracking many companies that are developing medicines in this area. I'll turn it over to my colleague Josh Riegelhaupt to discuss some of the development activity in the field.
Clearly, Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk are the leaders in the GLP-1 space, and we think the market will remain a duopoly between the two, at least until 2027 or 2028. As Neal discussed, Eli Lilly is following up the successes of Mounjaro and Zepbound with another weekly injectable called retatrutide, which has shown even greater weight loss in clinical trials, and they also have a daily oral called orforglipron. Novo Nordisk is similarly following up on the success of Ozempic and Wegovy by developing an injectable called CagriSema, This is a combination of the active ingredients in Wegovy and Ozempic's name is semaglutide, plus a novel target, the amylin protein. These also appear to have better efficacy than current offerings. Generally speaking, I'm of the view that when we peer into the future, there will not be a one-size-fits-all solution for obesity, but rather different patients will gravitate towards different treatments, particularly as we look at different endpoints, be it diabetes, pure obesity, heart failure, fatty liver, etc. Now, these new medicines from Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk represent high bars in terms of efficacy, safety, convenience, but there are a number of other pipeline drugs that we're following. In the injectable space, most near term is a product from Amgen, which is similar to Eli Lilly's Mounjaro, that will also be a monthly injectable. Roche, another large pharmaceutical company, recently bought a small company called Carmot Therapeutics for about $2.7 billion. And they too have a phase 2 ready injectable asset akin to Eli Lilly's Mounjaro. Similarly, a small biotech company called Viking Therapeutics has another competitor to Mounjaro in phase 2 development. There are other companies that we could list that are a little earlier in development, like Boehringer Ingelheim and Merck, or Zealand and Altimmune, but we will refrain from going too deeply into what they're exactly working on currently. In terms of orals for the GLP-1 space, the market is being led by Eli Lilly, as I mentioned, with orforglipron. Then it was followed by Pfizer, but they have stumbled as of recent with two assets looking like they are not competitive. AstraZeneca recently in-licensed a Chinese asset for about $185 million that we expect to get more clarity on in 2024. There's a small cap biotech company, Structure Therapeutics, that has a once daily oral in phase 2s. And then there's, again, a host of smaller companies such as Rigor, Calliope, Cywin, that we will not delve into deeply here. With that, I will turn the discussion back to David for Q&A from the audience. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate all that great information. We have a lot of questions coming in, so we'll get started with the first one is, do you have to stay on these drugs once you go on them, and what happens if you go off the drug? Maybe Wendy, get us started.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is that most people will regain weight. There were some trials where the companies looked at patients who were on GLP-1s for obesity and then stopped drug. And when people came off the drug, they regained half to 2/3 of the lost weight within a year. Some patients might be able to sustain their weight loss with lifestyle changes, but it's a minority. In those studies, I think it was about 1 in 6 patients were able to maintain 80% of their weight loss. But people are going to think that they can be part of that minority of patients and will want to try to come off drug. It just seems like most won't be able to keep the weight off and might go back on drug. This is a chronic condition. If you stop taking blood pressure or cholesterol medications, you don't think that your blood pressure or cholesterol is going to stay down. So this should be thought of the same way. Some insurance plans have restrictions on how long they'll pay for these drugs. For now, we think that these restrictions will disappear over time as we get more data and as kind of the pricing comes down. Back to you, David.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. And that actually addresses another question that someone had about insurance, so thank you. Another one coming in here. I've heard that you lose muscle on these drugs. Is that true, and is it a concern? Perhaps, Josh, could you take that one for us?
Thanks, David. So I suppose there is no way to lose weight without losing muscle. Just as a basic thought experiment, inside your muscle, there is fat, maybe 5 to 10% of the total weight. Also, if you lost weight, say you were 300 pounds and you went to 225 pounds, you just physically don't need as much muscle to move around because you weigh less. Now, we know that patients in these studies, in GLP-1 studies, lose somewhere between 25 to 40% of weight from lean mass. So the total 25 to 40% is from lean mass. This is in line with bariatric surgery. This is in line with dieting. And it's very confusing when you see reports about lean mass, because oftentimes these measurements are really non-normalized. So it depends what you're looking at. Are you using what's called the DEXA scan? Are you using a CT scan? What organ are you looking at? there isn't a reference or some level of consistency between these assays to really tease out a signal that is of any real concern. What's important to point out is when patients are on these drugs, what we call their functional scores, meaning their ability to do things like climb stairs, walk a mile, push your vacuum cleaner around to clean, seem to all improve, which is great. Now, we will obviously say it's always good to eat properly, incorporate exercise that has not just from an obesity perspective, that's just a good life perspective. So we certainly encourage that. Doctors who we listen to and who we've spoken to don't seem to be particularly concerned. There certainly is a push from industry to work on drugs that increase muscle mass. This is not necessarily a new push. It was very active in the 2000s, but it seems to have a bit of a resurgence. Initially got its start for cancer patients who are called sarcopenic, meaning they have muscle wasting, or old age. Also, people are sarcopenic where they have muscle wasting. There's interest in dealing with that. And in the same reference frame, there is something called sarcopenic obesity, which is a small percentage of the total, where if you are one of these patients, then these drugs are potentially contraindicated and you should talk to a physician. But generally speaking, we're not concerned. Thanks, David.
Great. Appreciate that, Josh. Another few questions, actually. I'll just ask Neal, maybe if you can dive back into insurance. A lot of people asking in some shape or form, does my insurance cover these types of drugs? Neal, could you handle that a little bit further in depth?
Sure. So if you're diabetic, your insurance most likely covers GLP-1 drugs. If you're not diabetic, but you're overweight and you meet the indications on the FDA label, it depends on your insurance coverage. Most of the people on this call probably have employer-sponsored health insurance, and roughly 30 to 50% of employer-sponsored plans cover GLP-1s for obesity today. Some have stricter requirements than what's on the drug label. For example, you might need a BMI over 33 to have coverage. The best way to check is to call your plan or to have someone at your doctor's office do so. Larger self-insured employers with longer tenured employees are more likely to cover GLP-1s. A lot of plans are on the fence where they'll say, we're not covering it this year, but we're very open to revisiting coverage in the near future. Most employers are hesitant to add coverage because of premium increases. But as we discussed today, GLP-1 drugs drive a real health benefit, and it's a reasonable benefit to be added to your insurance plan. Thanks. Back to you, David.
And Neal, you had mentioned that Medicare does not cover these drugs. A lot of questions about that here. So maybe you could delve into perhaps why not?
Sure. So that's half correct. Medicare does cover GLP-1s for diabetes, but not for obesity. So the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003 specifically bars Medicare from covering weight loss drugs. It will take an act of Congress to have Medicare cover GLP-1s for weight loss alone. There has been legislation introduced in Congress that does have bipartisan support, but that legislation will probably take some time to pass. In the meantime, Medicare can cover GLP-1s for additional indications as they are approved. So for example, GLP-1s are covered for diabetes. Novo has indicated they may be able to get coverage for patients with existing cardiovascular disease once the FDA reviews the data. And then there are also some near-term readouts for studies in obstructive sleep apnea and heart failure that would support additional indications that Medicare would cover. Back to you, David.
Thank you. And boy, the questions are really pouring in. Can taking GLP-1s lead to gastroparesis? Maybe Josh, could you help us with that?
Yeah, great question. So gastroparesis is what we would call on target. So that's the slowing of your GI tract, which is one of the mechanisms with these drugs work. So yes, it causes it. Now, you should know these drugs are not contraindicated in patients who have baseline gastroparesis. So so patients who come in with already this problem, you are still potentially eligible for to take these drugs, and there are patients in the real world now who do. Obviously, if that is a baseline characteristic for yourself, you should bring that up. That's important, and you should monitor for it. There is a very, very rare percentage of patients who have something that is similar to what happens to any of you who've had children and newborns. If you recall, they kind of jaundice or yellow before they are able to take their first excretion, their first bowel movement. And if things slow down so much that potentially is the case, it's so to tease this out a little further, it is not just the food that slows through your GI tract, but it is also the secretion of the enzymes that break it down. The whole system slows down. And if you are not breaking down all these things, you can increase what's called your bilirubin. Bilirubin is what leads to this yellowing. Again, this is a very infrequent occurrence. We're talking, much less than 1%. And something that generally is not a concern for the average patient without any comorbidity. Thanks, David.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Another question. You mentioned weight loss drugs for obese individuals. What do you consider to be obese? Wendy, could you help with that answer, please?
Sure. So the definitions that public health experts use are based on body mass index, BMI, and it's not a perfect measure. It takes your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And you can Google this, and there are charts that you can see how tall you are and how much you weigh, and tells you what your BMI is. And a BMI between 18 and 25 is considered healthy. 25 to 30 is considered overweight, and over 30 is considered obese. So for the obesity indication, GLP-1s are approved for patients with a BMI of over 30 or overweight BMI over 27 with an additional weight-related comorbidity such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and obviously GLP-1s are approved for diabetic patients. Thanks, David.
Okay. Technically, you don't qualify under BMI definitions, but I want to lose weight. Is it okay for me to take the drug? Wendy, do you want to expand on that at all?
Sure. Thanks for that question. I hear that question a lot. So first of all, let me preface this by saying that we're not doctors, so you should go talk to your doctor. But these drugs were only shown to be effective and safe in the patients that they were studied in the human clinical trials, which is what led to the indications in diabetes and obesity. However, I can imagine a patient who's just under that BMI cutoff and has prediabetes with a blood sugar measure that is just under the cutoff for diabetes, and I could see their doctor thinking that prescribing a GLP-1 drug would make sense. And the way that the system works in the US is that doctors can prescribe drugs off-label for conditions that they're not officially approved for, and the law allows this as long as it's not a controlled drug like opioid painkillers, and that the doctors who is prescribing it is signing it off as medically appropriate. Obviously, insurance doesn't have to pay for it, and the drug companies themselves can't promote any off-label usage of the drugs. And actually, Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk have been very clear in taking active stances against the use of GLP-1s for cosmetic weight loss. Thanks, David.
Okay, great. With these new drugs available, we have a question about, will existing obesity treatments become obsolete? And what about other areas of healthcare? Perhaps I'll kick that one over to Neal.
Good question. Obsolete is probably too strong of a word, but there will definitely be an impact on how we treat obesity. In terms of the companies that we follow and the related treatments they're involved in, the most direct impact will be on bariatric surgeries. So you can imagine that a number of patients who would be candidates for bariatric surgery might choose to try a GLP-1 first, even if some patients still not end up ultimately needing surgery. So this would be relevant for Intuitive Surgical, which makes robotic systems that are used in bariatric surgery procedures. And Intuitive has commented that they started to see a slowing in the growth rate of bariatric surgery cases using their robotic systems. But bariatric surgery represents only 4 to 5% of their total global procedures. And they have many other growth drivers, so we're not concerned about that for Intuitive Surgical. We've also been spending a lot of time researching how GLP-1 drugs could affect other conditions like diabetes and sleep apnea. On diabetes, we've been investors in Dexcom for many years because we think continuous glucose monitors are a critical tool to help patients manage their diabetes, and that CGM usage will grow substantially over the next decade. As we talked about, GLP-1s are very effective drugs for type 2 diabetes and can help patients delay or even prevent the need to start insulin. So we can imagine a world in 10 or 20 years where there are fewer type 2 diabetics that are dependent on insulin. However, we think CGMs will remain a critical tool for diabetic patients whether or not they are on insulin. There are roughly 5 times as many type 2 diabetics that aren't on insulin as there are that are on insulin, and very few non-insulin patients use CGMs today. Pricing and frequency of CGM use is less certain in this non-insulin using population, but the addressable market is still very large, and Dexcom is just starting to launch into this market. Regarding sleep apnea, we've been investors in Inspire Medical, which makes a device that treats patients with obstructive sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is a condition where your breathing starts and stops while you sleep because your airway is blocked, either from your tongue blocking the airway or your throat closing in. And their device, Inspire Medical's device, stimulates the hypoglossal nerve, which causes your tongue to move forward and open your airway. It's very effective for the right patient. The launch is still in the early days. We estimate only 5% of eligible patients are getting treated with Inspire therapy today. The concern is that obesity is a key driver for sleep apnea because extra fat around the neck region can cause the airway near the throat to collapse. And Lilly's running a study exploring whether Zepbound can treat sleep apnea in patients with obesity. And we think GLP-1s will be effective for these patients. However, we know that even with significant weight loss, many patients will still have moderate to severe sleep apnea. And that's because the weight loss only addresses the part of the airway where the throat closes, and it doesn't address cases where the tongue blocks the airway. Those are the cases that Inspire treats. So even though the adoption of GLP-1s could affect the funnel of patients who are seeking Inspire therapy treats sleep apnea in a fundamentally different way than weight loss. And we think Inspire therapy will remain an important treatment option for these patients. Back to you, David.
Okay, thanks, Neal. That was great. Questions about side effects. I'll just sum it up as, is there any long-term side effects that maybe haven't been discovered yet? Throw that one to Josh.
Thanks, David. So there's always unknown unknowns, and that's true with pharmaceutical drugs. What we can say is GLP-1s have been around for a couple decades now. They've been in tens of thousands of patients over years in clinical trials. That is usually a very good prognosticator of having vetted out anything rare in terms of a concern. I would mention that, of course, obesity itself has long-term side effects. So there is a cost-benefit analysis that anyone who's considering these things has to consider. And so it's not an overt concern, other than to say that, the future can always surprise, but not something we expect. Thanks, David.
Sure. Thanks, Josh. Questions about the generics. Looks like we have a bunch here, just kind of condensed into hearing about cheaper compounded generic semaglutides. What is that? Maybe Wendy, you can help us there.
Great, thanks, David. So generic semaglutide or tirzepatide. So semaglutide is the generic name for Wegovy, and tirzepatide is a generic name for Zepbound, the new GLP-1s on market today. These generics don't yet exist in the traditional sense of a generic, which is what happens when the drug goes off patent and generic pharma companies can start selling generic identical copies for less. These compounding pharmacies that are marketing these generic drugs today are separate facilities that sell custom-made medicines. For example, they're usually used to custom make a version of a drug that's different from what's available otherwise, such as without a certain allergen, or you can make a pill into a syrup for perhaps an elderly patient that's having trouble swallowing. When drugs are on the national drug shortage list, it's legal for compounding pharmacies to make and sell similar versions of a drug, even if it's still on patent, and that's the case with the GLP-1s. But the issue is that these compounding pharmacies aren't regulated in the same way that pharma companies are. The FDA doesn't certify that the drugs are safe, effective, and doesn't certify to their manufacturing quality. States have the right and the responsibility for the oversight of compounding pharmacies, and it really varies how often and how well they kind of inspect them. So some compounding pharmacies are probably producing reasonably quality drugs, but the FDA has concerns about how some of the compounding pharmacies have been manufacturing GLP-1s, and some studies have found significant impurities and less potent drugs coming from different compounding pharmacies. In one instance, they found one pharmacy that had the drug had no GLP-1 and it was just pure sugar alcohol, which you can think of as like injectable Splenda, which isn't the drug. So I guess to sum it up, it's available for now. Most of it's probably legal and use at your own risk. Back to David.
Great summary, Wendy. Thank you. I think we have just a few minutes left, so we have one more question. I'll take this from the queue down here. It says, this is all wonderful, but in talking to my doctor, he said insurance companies will not cover these drugs for obesity, and the cost can be $1,000 per month. How do we change this? Josh, I'm going to see if you could help with that one.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, David. Good question. So as Wendy kind of mentioned in her opening remarks, you can go cash pay direct for some of these things. Eli Lilly having the offering, at more closer to a little over $6,000 a year versus what was quoted in the question, I think is more towards $12,000 a year. I'd highlight that most of the manufacturers, Lilly's kind of spearheading this. They have a website. It's called Lilly Direct. There are ways to just directly interface with the manufacturer. The obesity space seems to be pioneering this approach. So you can check for that. Generally speaking, the price was going to come down. It's just a gating factor to that 2027, 2028 timeframe. List pricing won't change as long as supply falls drastically short of demand, which is the current case. All the major manufacturers are building out large capex investment, where billions and billions of dollars. I mean, almost every month there is another $5+ billion groundbreaking for a new facility, and so when supply normalizes, there's an expectation price will come down. There also is the transition, and probably 2024 will see a lot of this, where it comes to the interaction between employers, the large purchasers of insurance plans on behalf of employers, and the insurance companies themselves starting to figure out exactly how to cover these drugs. They are not fully penetrated, certainly, into general health insurance, and potentially many of you on this call right now, it's not covered by your insurance at all. There is some level of grassroots where employees are in discussions with their employer about what the covering should or shouldn't be. It can be seen both as a cost, and it will probably drive premiums up. Potentially, maybe shouldn't, and there's reasons to believe that. But it also can be seen as a advantage for an employer who will entice employees by offering them something that's a bit more "quote unquote" cutting edge in terms of offerings. But so those types of pressures will also lead to price reductions as these markets move more from price towards volume. So there's all signs that indicate that it'll get cheaper. It's just kind of going through the early stages of its growing pains. Thank you, David.
All right, great. Thank you, Josh, Neal, Wendy. Great information today. Appreciate it. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And thank you, of course, for investing with us and your interest in the Barron Healthcare Fund in particular. You'll be redirected at the end of this to a survey page. We appreciate any feedback you can provide on those surveys. And also check our website for replays and other information, www.barronfunds.com. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much.